Hi, I'm Devon Groh, and this is my Action Research Project presentation. So, this Action Research Project was conducted at Chaparral High School in my 11th grade U.S. History class. The data in this presentation was pulled from my third period class, which has 32 students. And here you can see a lovely picture of the front office of my school. I should also mention that Chaparral High School is located in Temecula, California, which is a suburban neighborhood, so mostly middle-class neighborhood, and I have a fairly diverse set of ethnicities, cultural backgrounds, and a little bit of variation in socioeconomics, but like I mentioned, mostly middle class. I should also mention before I move on that all my students do have access to a Chromebook from the school if they need one. However, most of my students actually have their own laptop, and usually they have a phone that they can use as well if we're doing something like a Pear Deck, which I'll cover in just a second. So let's talk about phase one. My question began to form when, due to a schedule-driven necessity, I had to assign a student-paced Pear Deck. And a Pear Deck, for those of you who don't know, is a interactive add-on to Google Slides where you can ask students questions, and if you're doing an instructor-paced version of the lesson, you can see the students answer the questions in real time and then, give feedback, things like that. Well, you can also do a student-paced version of it, and it's simply just, flip a switch basically, and it's now student-paced. And then that lets the students set the pace. They go through it on their own. You obviously can't provide real-time feedback in this scenario, but it lets the students take as long as they want, and you can then assign it as, well, an assignment. Considering the fact that this initial student-paced Pear Deck was assigned right before spring break, so the last week of March, I didn't really know what to expect. I thought that maybe they would kind of rush through it and maybe give some minimal answers because they were probably just dying to get to their spring break, but I was proved wrong. I found that most, if not all of my students, including the ones who tended to give shorter responses, maybe were a little bit more shy in class, actually performed very well. They gave some very insightful answers on this. And like I mentioned, my previous beliefs were erroneous. I assumed that the student-paced version of Pear Deck just wouldn't work very well. But I was happy to be proven wrong, and the fact that I was proven wrong actually unlocked some possibilities for my instruction. As we can see here, I pulled a small snapshot, but I chose this batch right here because it offered a pretty good cross-section of the types of responses that I got. As you can see, some of them are rather long and very insightful, but even the ones that are a little bit on the shorter side are still, it's clear that they read and understood most of what was in the Pear Deck. So that told me that I could trust them to do this stuff on their own without guidance, and that they would then retain some of this. So moving on, my question is this. How can I increase student engagement by optimizing the delivery and relevance of the content in my lessons? So while I was doing this, I was thinking, okay, so this student-paced version of Pear Deck works. So how can I offload some of the more facts and figures-based content knowledge onto those student-paced Pear Decks, let them go through it at their own pace, and then have them come to class equipped with that knowledge so that we can use the, limited time that we have together to dive into some more, deep, more narrowly focused discussions, really use that time in class to our advantage. So why did I arrive at this decision? Well, my initial question dealt more with simply focusing on what topic to cover in my live sessions as opposed to my asynchronous sessions. So it was more about sort of dividing up the content, but that only addressed part of the issue. It was incomplete. I realized that what I assign to my students outside of class is equally important to the picture as the in-class content. And after I talked to my critical friend group and I looked at that Pear Deck data, I tweaked my question to be more inclusive of the whole process. So now let's talk a little bit about phase 2. There's a little bit of a shake-up here. So I had completed all of my hyperdocs, and I had thought that I was going to do, because after spring break, which is when I was going to actually start doing the action research, I thought that I was going to be doing it on environmentalism, and I had 3 whole lessons planned out, and I had a rubric and an assessment, and everything was good. But because of the shift to a hybrid in-person model, my CT and I, we had to flip around a lot of the stuff that we did in that unit. We basically started at a completely different spot in the unit than I thought we were going to start at, and that threw a little bit of a wrench in my operation here. But it wasn't the end of the world. I was still able to use that same basic question: how do I optimize the relevance and the delivery of my content to improve engagement? I just had to do it a little bit differently and on a slightly different timetable. I used similar concepts to what I talked about in my hyperdocs, but like I mentioned, the timeline changed. I had a couple of new goals too, so I shifted my focus a little bit. I was only looking at the results of one primer lesson, as I'm calling it, and its effect on the subsequent in-class discussions. The in-class pear decks were now my primary mode of assessment as opposed to a more formal assessment that I was going to give at the end of my previously planned 3-lesson sort of mini unit. So the rubric for that is right here. Let's see if I can pull it up. Oh, by the way, here's the standards that I'm working with here. The History Social Science Standard 11.10, students analyze the development of federal civil rights and voting rights. And it's that entire thing, all of the substandards beneath that. So we're looking at multiple different groups: African Americans, Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, Hispanic Americans, LGBTQ, women's rights, and Americans with disabilities, among others. So basically, I was looking at their pear deck responses over a handful of weeks worth of content. And I also have an ELD standard in here too. This deals with the engagement and participation aspect. And that is the collaborative one at the bridging level. Contribute to class, group, and partner discussions, sustaining relevant you know it. I'm not going to sit here and read it to you. But this is the rubric that I'm using to assess, the pear deck participation. So back over to the slideshow. Let's talk a little bit about that primer lesson that I mentioned. This was the first lesson given, and there's my little welcome back from spring break deal there. This was the first lesson that we gave them upon their return back to school. So we started with a hate map that we've done before, and I'll spare you the nitty-gritty of this, but this lesson basically goes over, this is a big one, the ladder of prejudice. We came back to this multiple times during the semester, but we talk about what justice is, the 3 types of justice that we'd be looking at this unit. We'd look at the difference between equity and equality, and we dive into more accurate and detailed definitions there, and a little bit of other things. So this again was an in-class lesson, and what I was now looking at is how well they retain, because I put a lot of the sort of defining things, getting them ready to then use these concepts when talking about different civil rights issues throughout the unit. So I was then looking at how well that held up. So now let's go over to, and like I said, I was looking at a handful of weeks worth of pear deck data, but for time's sake, I'll just show you a couple of lessons that I exported, and I highlighted a few of the notable responses. And you can see here, it worked pretty well. You can see here, students are routinely coming back to that. One thing I noticed is that they're not mentioning justice, equity, or equality explicitly, but in all of the, not just the ones I highlighted, but a lot of their responses here, they're talking about those concepts. So, what did I learn about myself as a teacher through this? Well, first off, I learned that you got to be flexible. I mean, I didn't learn this, but it was a great example of having to be flexible. I was so ready to do all of the stuff that I had originally planned to do. Guys, I was really excited to do like my 3 lessons on environmentalism. I had this awesome like backbone of the national park system to frame everything around that because I know my students like that so much. I figured it'd foster a lot of engagement. I figured the asynchronous paradox that I had lined up would prep us for some really cool discussions. It just because of the schedule shift, the fact that I just didn't have time to really do what I originally wanted to do. And through it all, it was still valuable to me because I was able to play around with a concept that I had addressed previously in my Cold War unit, which is, having that backbone of a entire unit laid out early on in the unit and then to keep coming back to it. The difference in this unit is that I gave them all of the definitions of justice, equity, and equality at the beginning, and I left it to them to make those connections. If they needed help, I would step in and explain it, but I didn't do the legwork up front. I left it up to them. So I think that's why, some of the responses were not quite as specific as I was hoping for. And as we're wrapping up here, I want to talk briefly about the UDL framework that I implemented during my, really across this whole unit. Because of the shift that I had to do, I wasn't able to rely as much on UDL 8.1 as I originally wanted to. We had a couple of asynchronous assignments, but we needed to pack so much content in there that most of them were the videos that I usually do, which is fine, but that's another UDL framework. So that's something that I didn't get to do that I planned on doing. But I was still able to implement UDL 7.2 and 5.1. 7.2 engaging or relevance. I was able to do that. As I usually am able to do, find some relevant pop culture ties to the content, and something that was especially, I don't want to say easy, but, well, yeah, easy. Something that was easy to do with a civil rights and activism unit is tie it to current day events that I know my students do care about. We are going through a time here in America that is riddled with civil rights issues. And it's not a stretch to connect these concepts to what my students are experiencing in their lives. And that could also be a factor in why a lot of my responses were pretty good throughout this unit. So it almost makes it a little bit murky as to whether it was my teaching or it was just because they saw the connections themselves. And then UDL 5.1, allowing multiple means of responses. They were able to obviously use the paradox, like I said, but they also were pretty active in the Zoom chat. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to save that and present it here. But there was actually a lot of discourse between my students, which was really nice to see. And again, they were discussing their views on current day issues in relation to the content that we were talking about. So I was able to facilitate some more discussion there. But again, it's hard to see, at least based on this limited time frame, it's hard to see whether or not that was from the modification in the teaching methods or if it was from the, relevant and controversial content. So some thoughts to end on here. Even though I didn't get to implement all the stuff that I wanted to, and I didn't get to use any of that really well thought out stuff that I had made in preparation for this, I still learned that my primer lesson was pretty effective in giving my students, giving them sort of this rock to go off of when we're talking about these complex, very controversial sometimes civil rights issues. Because, my students, they feel passionate about these things, but sometimes they need that primer of what is justice, what is equity, what is equality, things like that, to contextualize the injustices that we talked about and to give them something to go off of, like a primer. Like I said, this was a valuable process for me, but I really do want to actually implement the stuff that I originally did plan on implementing at some point. So I hope you enjoyed what I was able to put together, and I'm sorry if it was a little bit less than coherent. Bye.